They called me suspicious before my dog finished sniffing the mailbox. A cruiser slid into the shade, an officer with a practiced smirk and a sleeping body cam, stepping out like the sidewalk belonged to him. Eyes skating over my face, the leash, my weathered hands gripping a blue folder, deed, HOA letter, taxes paid, while ring cameras blinked awake across manicured porches and a new neighbor pretended not to stare. The air smelled of cut grass and hot brake dust. A sprinkler ticked behind a white picket fence, and the sun bleached the curb paint as he asked where I was going on my own block and why my route looked different, his palm grazing the radio like my name was a problem to be solved, not a person to be greeted. I felt the old pulse rise, counted to 3 the way my late wife taught me, and between my dog's steady breath and those unblinking doorbells, I reached for procedure like a key, ready to demand the supervisor, open the folder, and turn their routine into a record they could not bend. Before I go on, hit subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. If this speaks to you, share it. Awareness protects our elders. They said I looked suspicious before I finished my first lap around the block. It came soft like a rule whispered through a smile, the kind of voice that makes the ground tilt even when the sky looks clean. The cruiser slid in beside the curb without siren or lights, just the steady hum of an engine that didn't need to prove anything. My dog stopped, one paw lifted, ears high. I felt the leash tighten in my palm and the little bag of picked-up waste press against my fingers. Somewhere a sprinkler clicked, and the air smelled like wet mulch and laundry soap leaking from a dryer vent. I stood there with my blue folder tucked under my arm, the same folder I take when I have to remind people who I am. Deed, HOA letter, property tax receipts, paper that turns opinion into facts. The officer stepped out fast, shoulders square, chin up, like a stopwatch had already started before I appeared. He called it a routine check. For what, he didn't say. Routine like a word meant to sand down the edges of something rough. His boots scuffed the grit along the curb. A radio on his shoulder popped with little bursts of coded chatter. I nodded, counted to 3 inside my chest the way my wife taught me when doors didn't open. 1 for breath, 2 for my dog, 3 for the paper that cannot shake. I told him I lived here, not a speech, just a sentence placed carefully where it could be seen. I gave my name and kept my hand visible over the leash. My dog turned his head and nosed my thigh, warm and steady. The officer asked where I was going and why my route looked different from yesterday. I didn't argue about my rights to walk a different sidewalk in a neighborhood I helped rake and shovel and pay for. I pointed to the tiny metal tag on my dog's collar, said his microchip was registered in my name at this address. I raised my wrist slightly so the screen of my watch caught the sun. The trail app glowed with our path and time-stamped pace. He didn't look at the watch. He asked for ID, and I handed over my driver's license. He kept my card a beat too long, like it needed a second story I had not yet told. He called my birth date into the radio without taking his eyes off me, and the sound of my year and month traveling through the air felt like a private shirt turned inside out. Behind him, a curtain shifted in a front window. A ring camera clicked, that little mechanical purr when motion wakes it up. My dog sat. I told him he was good in the low voice I use when we pass loud trucks. He yawned, tongue curled, not understanding the ritual of proving you belong to sidewalks. I asked if his body cam was on. Not a challenge, just a line from a policy I read the day I learned to carry the blue folder. He touched the square on his chest and said yes, then asked again what I was doing and how long I planned to be out. Routine, he repeated, the syllables clipped and tidy. I told him I was on my morning walk, that I pick up after my dog, that the bag in my hand was proof enough of that. I said I could show him documents that confirm my residency.
The blue folder slid a little against my ribs. The edge of it was warm through my shirt. He waved at the folder without reaching for it, like facts were loud but unwelcome this early. I watched his gaze flick to the houses. New paint, new stone, new security stickers, and I could feel the shape of the story he was being asked to stand inside. Suspicious man, unfamiliar route, neighborhood watch report. The sign at the corner with the glassy eye and the words "We see you" felt less like protection and more like a warning stenciled on my back. I thought of my wife's recipe cards and the way she underlined measurements: breathe, hold, place, press. I put the folder on my forearm in a way that looked neither defensive nor defeated. The mail truck turned a corner with that rubbery squeal I've known since I could bench press a bag of dirt. The carrier rolled slow, one hand on the wheel, the other ready for a mailbox lid. He saw me, saw the cruiser, saw the leash in my fingers, and I watched his eyebrows make the quick decision to witness. He parked half a length back and stepped down with his satchel slung across his chest. The scent of paper and glue followed him, clean and old-fashioned. He didn't say anything, just let his presence land in the scene the way a weight stops a door from drifting shut. I asked the officer for the incident number. He paused, blinked, hit a note on his phone with the thumb of a man who has done this so often it feels like muscle memory. He said he could give it once he opened the call in the system. He asked if I had any warrants. The question arrived as lightly as a question about weather, but settled heavier. I kept my face still and my voice measured. I said no, and I added that this was my home block, that my mortgage receipt sits behind the HOA letter in this folder, that my taxes for this year were paid on the first day they would take them. I looked at the ring of keys clipped to my belt, then back to the officer's eyes. A second cruiser rolled slowly past, like an animal testing a fence. It continued to the end of the street, paused where the stop sign cast a trapezoid of shade, then reversed and parked behind the first. No lights. The air was warm but felt thin. I could smell the metallic tang that comes off hot brakes. My dog's ears rotated toward the new engine. He didn't stand. I bent my knees to lower my center and put my free hand on the dog's chest for one long second. The officer asked me to keep my hands where he could see them. I did. I asked again if he would please open a call and provide the number, and I mentioned that I wished to speak to a supervisor. I used the words "on record" and "on scene" because I have learned that phrases can be anchors. He asked why I needed a supervisor. I said I wanted to ensure that procedures were followed and that I was documenting time and contact, his unit number, his name, the block, the minute my watch had already captured. I repeated that I had proof of residency and that I was requesting clarity on the reason for the stop. The second officer stayed in the new cruiser, glancing down at a terminal. The neighborhood settled into a hush, like the wind paused to listen for the outcome. A child's scooter lay in a driveway, bright plastic faded on the side that always meets the sun. The officer stepped back and muttered something to his radio, the posture of a man making a decision he would prefer not to own alone. The radio answered in clipped pieces. He nodded, looked at me, then at the blue folder, then at my dog. The mail carrier shifted his satchel and checked his watch in a deliberate motion that writes time on air. The bag in my hand crinkled softly when I tightened my grip. I thought about the morning coffee cooling on my kitchen counter, the smell probably still sitting near the sink, and I felt the quiet anger that arrives not as heat, but as a careful cold.
I told the officer I would wait. I said I would continue to document. I described for the record my dog's tag and the microchip number visible on the clinic's website, the path on my watch, the property record any county clerk terminal could call up with my name. I did not raise my voice. I did not step forward. I did not give him any story he could use that didn't belong to the paper I carried. He nodded again, slower this time. and his hand left the radio to rest on his belt. Around us, the morning continued its routines. The mail carrier slid envelopes into a box, as if proving ordinary life was still possible. A kitchen fan rattled in the distance. A lawn crew started a blower a street over, and the sound came like surf through the houses. I could taste the chalk of dust the tires had kicked up when they first stopped. I told my dog he was good one more time. He blinked back, calm in the way only a creature can be when he trusts the hand he's attached to. The officer returned from the edge of the curb. He said a supervisor was on the way. He didn't apologize, and I didn't ask him to. I shifted the folder to my left arm because my right hand was getting tired from holding the leash just so. The shadow of the cruiser cooled my shoes, and I felt the damp set into my socks. A cyclist rolled past on the opposite side of the street and pretended not to slow down. The second cruiser's engine idled at a steady rhythm that made time feel measured and unavoidable. I heard the new engine before I saw the car. A different tone, lower, the kind meant to arrive without drama. The cruiser eased to the stop sign and turned toward us as if careful not to bruise the air. And as it settled to the curb, the rear door opened and a man with a silver bar on his collar put one foot on the pavement. He planted the second foot and straightened, the silver bar on his collar catching the same sun that made my watch screen glare. He moved with the quiet authority of someone used to stepping into scenes already half written. The first officer shifted a fraction to the side, weight off his heels, and the air changed temperature in that small way crowds notice but can't describe. My dog's ears tipped forward. The leash hummed faintly against my skin. I could smell warm vinyl from the new cruiser and a ribbon of gasoline that had risen from the cap when the car stopped. Somewhere a wind chime clinked once and then held its breath. I gave the supervisor my name and address before he asked, because I've learned that placing facts early is like setting anchors before the tide swings. I told him I was requesting an incident number, that I had documentation of residence, that I wished to ensure procedures were followed. He nodded once, slow, and his eyes went to the square camera on the first officer's chest. He asked a question I couldn't hear, and the officer answered with his jaw tight and his hand hovering near the radio. The supervisor glanced down at his phone and then at the unit's terminal through the windshield, measuring time against time. He tried to shape the moment into a random check. That phrase slid over the pavement like a tarp, trying to cover the awkward furniture of what had actually happened. I felt it catch on corners. I asked if the body camera had been activated at initial contact. The pause told me more than his words. He said there would be footage. He did not say from when. I rested the blue folder against my hip and thought of all the times I had been told to be patient by people who moved faster than my patience could protect.
I placed the folder on my forearm and opened the first sleeve. Paper slid softly, a dry whisper that felt like strength. The deed sat on top of the property record, both edges aligned on purpose, because order has a sound and I wanted them to hear it. The HOA letter rested just beneath, the language cool and institutional. The tax receipt, stamped and dated, was a clean square of proof that smells faintly of toner and office air. I showed the supervisor the stack as if it were a compass, not a weapon. He didn't touch the papers. His eyes rested on the letterhead long enough to understand that opinion had company. The mail carrier became my ballast. He stood off to my right, half in sun, half in the cruiser's shadow, and the smell of paper and glue and canvas was as steady as a clock. He checked his wristwatch in a motion that turned time into a witness, He didn't speak, but his route sheet in the satchel might as well have read, "At this block, at this minute, saw this man with a dog in a blue folder." I felt a little of the tightness leave my throat. Not victory, not even relief, just the sensation that I wasn't floating alone in someone else's version. Across the street, a door opened and a neighbor stepped out as if to shake a mat. The doormat barely moved, but the Ring camera above him blinked a tiny white light. He lifted a hand in acknowledgement at the scene without inviting himself into it. I watched his gaze flick to his phone, then back to the camera, and I understood what he was thinking. The feed had been rolling before the cruiser stopped. Time again, stacked like plates. The Ring camera time code, my watch's GPS trail, the mail carrier's route minutes, the cruiser terminal log, the officer's memory, the policy that says when a body cam must begin to listen. The supervisor signaled to the first officer to open a call in the system. A brief buzz came from the handheld, a digital chime that told me a file now existed with a blank space where narrative would go. He asked for my date of birth and my phone number for the record. I gave him, feeling the way data fits into boxes made by people who never imagined my sidewalk would be their problem. He asked if I had business in the area. I told him my business was living here, and I rested 2 fingers on the deed without making a show of it. The word routine tried again to make itself comfortable between us. I saw the supervisor shift his weight when it didn't quite fit. I asked when I would receive the incident number. He said once the call was fully populated. He had that practiced calm that leans toward the bureaucratic, the kind that can feel like kindness if you hadn't carried a blue folder long enough to know the difference. I reminded him I was documenting the interaction by time and badge. He adjusted his posture by a few degrees, less defensive, more formal. The first officer kept his eyes trained past me, at a point on the sidewalk a little to my left, as if the concrete there needed attention. He walked through the steps he wanted recorded. Citizen identified, routine check, confirmation of residency pending. Pending. That word landed on my tongue like a chalky peel. I told him I could provide immediate confirmation. I set the HOA letter at the top of the stack, the property record behind it, and the tax receipt below. The paper had weight that my bones recognized. I noticed the smear of blue ink on the edge of the property record from where my pen had touched it last week. My dog nudged my leg and exhaled. His breath smelled faintly of the biscuit he got before we left the house. The normal detail calmed me like a hand on the back. The supervisor took a half step closer to the first officer's camera. He touched the unit and listened to the quiet spin of electronics. He looked back at his phone. His expression told a small story. The file existed, but the camera timestamp didn't start when it should have. He explained in careful language that footage would be available. My chest felt like someone had folded a map across it and pressed the creases with the thumbnail. I could hear the neighbor's Ring camera hum wakefully again, as if aligning with my pulse. If the camera on the chest had slept through the opening beats, the little doorbell eye had been at attention.
The second cruiser's engine ticked as it cooled. A plane stitched a white seam across the bright square of sky between roofs. The scent of cut grass drifted down from a yard at the far corner where a mower had just shut off. I asked that the late activation be noted on the record. The supervisor nodded. The first officer's shoulders rounded an inch, as if a weighted bar had been set on them. He didn't look at me.
He looked at the blue folder with the distance of a man who has seen too many folders and doesn't want to see this one. Oppression is not always a shove. Often it is a series of measurements taken with a dull ruler. Stand here, answer again, wait for the number, watch your voice, watch your hands, accept the word routine until it becomes the air in your lungs. I felt each instruction settle onto my skin, and I let them sit there without letting them sink. I have learned to be respectful without surrendering my outline. The mail carrier's quiet shifting of weight felt like a promise that the minute hand would be honest. The supervisor asked the first officer to confirm the nature of the call. A report from the neighborhood watch, he said. Unexplained activity. The word suspicious hovered unspoken like a draft. I thought of the sign at the corner and the email the HOA had sent last winter about vigilance. Good intentions, perhaps, but untrained eyes and easy alarms make blunt tools. I told the supervisor I would also be requesting a copy of the relevant policy for responding to such calls. He gave me the kind of look people give when they realize a conversation will outlast their patience. A pickup eased down the street with the careful confidence of a truck that knew every driveway. It slowed when the driver saw the cluster of uniforms, the mail truck, the neighbor leaning like punctuation. A clipboard winked in the passenger seat. I recognized the face before the logo on the door became readable from the angle. The neighborhood watch coordinator. Tidy hair, tidy shirt, the look of a man who holds meetings about feelings and calls them safety. He parked 2 houses up and took one long look at the scene as if deciding where to set his version. Before he could step down, I asked the supervisor to note that my request for a supervisor had been made early, that I had asked about body cam activation, that I had produced documentation of residency. He nodded again, and that nod landed inside me like a stake, hammered just deep enough to resist a small wind. The pickup door opened with a hollow thump, and the clipboard came out like a flag. The coordinator started toward us, smiles stiff, steps crisp, the smell of cologne arriving a second ahead of his shoes. He stopped at the edge of our triangle of shade and sun, looking from face to face, reading the map. He said he just wanted to help clarify what he had been told. His tone had the soft velvet that coats hard candy. The supervisor drew a breath that said he would let this in as long as it stayed useful. The first officer shifted again, pen ready. The mail carrier steadied his satchel with a hand, the strap creaking in the quiet like a hinge that needed oil. The neighbor across the street held his phone at chest height and watched the tiny ring of light on his doorbell with the attention of someone who has finally realized his hardware is not just decoration. I understood then that the report would be a vessel and that the story poured into it could either seal me in or hold space for air. I held the blue folder a little tighter, felt the edge bite into my palm, and prepared to set my papers down one more time where everyone could see them glow under the sun. The impromptu meeting on the curb was about to decide which version became official.
The clipboard hovered like a verdict, and I felt the street become a narrow hallway where only one story could fit. I shifted the blue folder from my forearm to the trunk lip of the cruiser and let the metal take the weight. The paint was warm under my palms, dusty with a thin film that collected on my fingertips. I laid out the papers in a sequence I could stand inside: deed, county property record, HOA letter, tax receipt. The plastic sleeves whispered when I slid them, a small, dry sound that cut through the soft engine idle. The mail carrier moved half a step closer, and the canvas of his satchel rasped against his shirt like a reminder that some jobs are older than our fears. The supervisor tried to smooth the moment into a checklist. He asked for clarifications with that measured voice I recognized from town halls and parking disputes.
The first officer hovered, pen poised, eyes aimed somewhere past my left shoulder, as if careful not to touch the center. The neighborhood watch coordinator kept his clipboard angled toward his chest, body turned to show he belonged to both sides without committing to either. I watched the angle of his shoulders and saw the outline of a summary already forming in his head. A concern, a call, a check, a misunderstanding. The word misunderstanding arrived in my imagination like a lid being fitted over a pot that never boiled. I rested 2 fingers on the deed and breathed through the dryness in my mouth. Oppression held steady in the familiar ways, the slight delay before a camera wakes, the shape of a question that asks for permission I already have, the convenience of a term like routine when the specifics feel sharp. The leash tugged once and then went slack. My dog settled at my heel, chest rising and falling with the steady patience I wanted to borrow. I named the time in my head again and placed it against the soundscape around me. Engine, distant blower, the faint chatter from a radio, the click of the neighbor's doorbell lens as it refocused. The neighbor stood at the edge of his porch, phone cradled in one hand, eyes flicking between the screen and the little black eye above his door. He raised his chin in a gesture that did not break the quiet, and then tapped his screen twice. I understood the promise in that small act. The camera had been awake before the first cruiser angled in, and its numbers mattered more than anyone's memory. The mail carrier checked his watch again, an open display that put another hand on the clock. The scene had acquired a frame. Camera time code, route minute, my watch trail, cruiser terminal log. A record was growing in public air. I felt the bicycle before I heard it, the quick rhythm of tires on seams where the sidewalk slabs meet, and then the bright bell that belonged to my granddaughter, as surely as her laughter used to belong to my living room. Maya rolled up with her backpack tight against her shoulders and a tablet already waking in her hands. The sight of her lifted something behind my ribs that had been heavy since the first officer said, "Routine." She braked, put one foot down and let her breath settle before she moved, the way I taught her when we practiced checking oil on the old mower. Without words, we found our places. I kept the paper spine. She built the digital body. She opened a shared folder and named it with the date and the block, clear and plain, not dramatic. She held her device over the papers, capturing angles that included letterheads and signatures, and the edges of my blue folder for scale. She requested the neighbor's doorbell clip through the app, and I watched the blink of acknowledgement appear on his screen and then on hers. She checked my watch, asked with her eyes, and I tilted my wrist so she could record the trail and the timestamps. She paired the dog's tag number with the clinic's registration page, and I felt the gentle efficiency of a generation that grew up making maps out of scattered dots.
The supervisor watched the quiet machinery of our work and adjusted his posture. The first officer made notes, his pen clicking softly in a pattern that told me he was keeping up but not eager to be seen as participating. The neighborhood watch coordinator stepped forward with his clipboard, held as if it could shield him from the shape of the truth. He said he had received reports of unfamiliar movement and concerns about recent break-ins on the other side of the subdivision. He did not use the word suspicious, but I could taste it in the way his gaze lingered. He pointed at a general direction that did not match my route. Maya, unbothered by his performance, tagged a screenshot of my path with a small arrow and set it beside the line of videos in her folder. The smell of hot brakes thinned as the engine settled. A patch of shade had crept across the asphalt toward my shoes, and I shifted my weight to keep the folder in steady light. I asked the supervisor to note that the body camera had not been active at initial contact. He nodded and repeated a phrase about procedure that sounded careful enough to be read into a record later. He said there would be an internal review. Internal, like a room without windows. The word pressed against my patience. I set the tax receipt on top of the stack and slid the HOA letter half an inch to reveal the header again,
the way a teacher might underline a sentence for a student who pretends not to see. Maya organized the incoming files in a way that calmed the part of me that shakes when authority forgets its purpose. She used simple names and added times to each one. First, the neighbor's clip showing me and the dog passing 2 minutes before the first cruiser slowed. Then the angle from across the street that caught the cruiser gliding to a stop. Then my watch trail with pace and distance. She created a brief note file that listed the unit numbers and badge numbers I had already spoken to the air, as if to give my old habit of memorizing a younger pair of legs. The mail carrier handed me a small slip from his pad with the minute he had turned onto the block, a modest gesture that felt like a plank laid across water. The neighborhood watch coordinator tried to reroute the conversation toward intent. He described concern and vigilance and community standards, words I have heard woven into blankets that never warmed the right people. I measured my breath against his cadence and refused to let it pull me off my mark. I asked the supervisor to include in the call that I had requested a supervisor early and had asked about camera activation before I was asked about warrants. The rhythm of the pen changed in the first officer's hand, and I knew the sentence found its way onto the page. Oppression thickened in the small ways. The sun pressed harder on the back of my neck when the conversation drifted toward general safety. The clipboard hovered closer to the trunk as if to share space with my documents. The promise of an incident number stayed just out of reach, while details not about me tried to find their way into the center. My dog shifted, sighed, and settled his chin on my shoe, a touch that felt like an oath I did not make alone. Maya's presence cut the angle of the moment, a line of light across a room going dim. She asked the neighbor, without words, with a glance and a held-up screen, for the second clip, the one that faced down the sidewalk. The new file slid into her folder, a quiet chime stealing nothing from anyone. I asked for the path to request the body camera footage formally. The supervisor described a process in measured terms that added up to time and patience. He did not sound dismissive. He sounded like a man who knows the machinery and knows it moves at one speed, and it is not the speed of a heart that wants to be believed. I asked that the activation delay be documented in the call. He agreed. The first officer shifted his weight and studied the space over my right shoulder again. The angle of his attention had become its own weather.
Across the street, the neighbor adjusted his phone and tapped again. The Ring camera clicked, woke, recorded. The small mechanical sound fed my resolve the way a cough of wind fills a tired sail. The mail carrier checked his watch a third time, then wrote something small on his slip and tucked it into my folder sleeve like a bookmark. The routine of his route, boxes, flags, lids, flags, boxes, refused to bend. I held on to that normal rhythm as proof that this block belonged to more than the story being built on a clipboard. Maya marked each file with a simple tag so we could find them in order. She gave the folder a color and placed a tiny star next to the note file that held the unit and badge numbers. She looked at me in that quiet way my wife used to look at a crossword clue no one else could get, and I felt steadied. The supervisor received a message on his phone and then glanced at the terminal through the windshield again. He said the incident number would be texted to me, and I watched his thumb move slowly across the screen to make it so. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The number arrived like a coordinate pinned to a map. It was not relief. It was position. It was the difference between drifting and being charted. I saved the text
and forwarded it to Maya's folder so that our paper spine and digital body wore the same name. The neighborhood watch coordinator looked down at his clipboard and then back at the scene, and for the first time his expression changed. He had found fewer places to tuck his version. The supervisor cleared his throat and said there would be follow-up, internal review again. I gathered the papers, sleeves sliding into place with that dry whisper that has become the sound of my patience. The air shifted, and a car rolled to a stop at the far end of the block. Not a cruiser, not a neighbor I recognized. A compact with a magnet placard on the door. A hand lifted from behind the windshield in a small, non-committal greeting. The journalist from the local paper stepped out, notepad in a back pocket, phone in his hand, eyes already scanning for light and shade. He did not speak to me, did not disrupt the scene, just measured it. The neighborhood watch coordinator pressed his lips together and glanced at the supervisor as if the stage lights had grown brighter. I felt the thin wire of humiliation transmute into a firmer strand of resolve. My blue folder rested against my ribs with a heavier, more honest weight. My dog leaned into my shin and sighed again. Maya tapped her screen twice, then once more, fastening the set of files and notes in a way that told me the shape would hold if someone tried to bend it. My phone vibrated a second time, a softer buzz that drew my eyes downward to a new notification, and the subject line on the screen fixed the next step like a nail set deep in clean wood. If this is reaching you, leave a like. Share your thoughts in the comments and send it to a friend who cares. The subject line on my screen said what my chest needed. Agenda item confirmed. Resident presentation. The words carried the weight of a key sliding home. I forwarded the email to Maya's folder and felt the phone's soft buzz answer back from her pocket. The street eased around us again. Ordinary sounds returning with a little more honesty. The journalist lingered at a distance, making notes without stepping inside anyone's shadow. The neighborhood watch coordinator returned to his truck with a clipboard that looked less certain. The supervisor spoke briefly to the first officer, his posture tightening into procedure. I gathered the papers into their sleeves, the plastic whispering like a zipper closing a weatherproof bag before rain.
I arrived early to the multi-purpose room with the blue folder and a spiral notebook, the kind with a cardstock cover that resists kitchen spills in courtroom glare. The air smelled like lemon cleaner and old coffee. Folding chairs stacked along the wall made a faint tin sound when someone brushed them. A ceiling unit pushed cool air that carried a hint of dust from vents that hadn't been wiped since last winter. The big clock over the whiteboard clicked forward 1 minute, then rested. I let it anchor me. Maya set her backpack on the table, opened her tablet, and the screen lit her face the way sunlight once lit my wife's recipe cards at our old kitchen table. She sorted the files into a simple sequence: timeline first, then the clips, then the policy excerpt, then the county property page, the HOA letter, the tax receipt, and the incident number on its own slide. She gave the folder a name that would fit into minutes without drama. I checked the sign-up sheet at the door, the polite parade of names that means someone will hear you even if they don't want to. I added mine and printed clearly so the clerk wouldn't have to guess. The liaison from the police department arrived with a notebook and a tablet, his badge clipped in a way that suggests he keeps it visible so no one has to ask. His cologne smelled like clean linen and office air. He greeted the HOA president and the compliance chair with a nod that felt practiced and careful. They reviewed the agenda at the lectern, moving their fingers down the list, pausing at the line that held my name and the words "resident concern" regarding stop and neighborhood call protocol. The clerk checked the recorder, the red light pulsing like a small heart on the table.
The neighbor who had offered his camera clip signed in and hovered near the back with the posture of someone who wants to help but doesn't want to become the story. He carried a printout of his device's log with times and thumbnails, the ink still fresh enough to smell faintly of solvent. The mail carrier had left a note with the time he turned onto our block and a phone number that would reach him after his route. It was clipped to a small manila card and slid into my folder. The journalist asked the president, in that careful public tone professionals use, about access to exhibits once approved for the record. She said there would be a process and that the liaison would consult with his department regarding redaction. Everyone nodded as if small fences had been set. The neighborhood watch coordinator entered with a thinner clipboard and a face that had lost some shine. He took a seat 2 rows back and studied the agenda as though it might reveal an exit. The compliance chair, a person with a tidy haircut and tidy lines of highlighter on the bylaws, reviewed a draft flowchart for non-emergency calls. Observe, describe conduct, verify address if known, call only with objective detail, record time, do not label a person without describing behavior. The pen tapped once, twice, and the draft found a corner of the table near my folder. I read it without touching and recognized the way a neighborhood learns to speak to itself without letting fear do all the talking. Maya tested the connection from her tablet to the wall monitor. The cable clicked into place with a precise little sound, and the opening slide filled the screen with the simplest of words, timeline. She had placed the date, the block, and the beginning minute in one corner. She had tucked the incident number in the other. No flourish, no drama, just signposts. She asked if the audio would be recorded and received a nod from the clerk. She placed a copy of our sequence on a flash drive and slid it across for the record, the little metal edge catching the light like a blade that cuts only paper.
I set the blue folder on the table and opened the first sleeve just enough to breathe. The deed waited like a photograph of home that never changes. The property record had my name in a font I had learned to trust. The HOA letter repeated the kind of sentences that sound like they were written by people who iron their shirts on weekends. The tax receipt sat at the back like a solid shoe. I added the mail carrier's card to the front and placed the neighbor's printout behind the policy excerpt. I wrote the unit numbers and badge numbers in my spiral, large and clear so I could read them without squinting when the room became busy. The pen left a groove in the paper that would survive a scan. The president opened the meeting with the usual business, approval of minutes, a landscaping update, a request to keep trash bins out of sight on non-collection days. The rhythm of it soothed me. Normal life has its own ceremony, and I wanted ours back. When the time came for resident concerns, she announced the agenda item in a tone that neither dramatized nor minimized. The liaison confirmed he would speak to policy in general terms and would not address personnel. I appreciated the structure. It felt like rails under a train whose destination I could not choose, but whose track would not be changed mid-journey. I described, in the same measured way I had used on the curb, the sequence of my morning walk. I let the clock do most of the speaking. I noted the minute my watch registered the first lap. I noted the minute the first cruiser stopped. I noted the delay between the question asked and the camera that was supposed to be ready. I explained that the neighbor's doorbell had witnessed the opening beats before any officer had. I kept my voice steady and held my breath between paragraphs the way my wife taught me. Pause, let the room catch up, place the next fact. My dog had stayed at home with a biscuit and the window cracked. I pictured his brown eyes while I spoke and borrowed his calm. Maya moved through the sequence, tapping once to advance, 2 fingers to enlarge a timestamp when the liaison leaned in to see. She did not speak toward the room. She communicated with motion and allowed the screen to carry the language. Numbers, arrows, location dots, a still frame where my dog's leash crossed my knee like a line drawn with a soft pencil. The neighbor gave the clerk his printout and nodded permission for the file to be part of the record. The clerk thanked him with a professional smile and labeled the document with the date and item number. The liaison outlined the general policy regarding camera activation and acknowledged with cautious care that every department manages exceptions but should document them clearly.
When he said the word should, I saw the compliance chair underline something in the bylaws draft. The neighborhood watch coordinator offered a short statement about community vigilance, about recent break-ins, about calls made in good faith. He avoided the word suspicious. He described intent. I listened, not because I needed his reasoning, but because the room needed to hear how those calls sound when they're cleaned for company. Then the compliance chair read the draft flowchart aloud for the room. Observe and describe conduct. Avoid labels. Check known addresses. Document time. Only call with objective behavior. Record who witnessed what. The paper made a soft hiss as it slid across the president's table toward the liaison, who scanned it and nodded without warmth or resistance. I requested, without drama, that the meeting minutes include the steps I took on the curb, the request for a supervisor, the inquiry about camera activation, the presentation of documents, the presence of witnesses, the request for an incident number. The clerk wrote steadily, the red light on the recorder pulsing as if to agree. I asked that the minutes reflect that the neighbor's doorbell caught footage of the earliest moments and that the mail carrier could confirm the time he turned onto the block. The president confirmed that submissions received would be attached to the record. Procedure, patient and plain, set its feet.
During a brief pause, I looked at the patch of carpet under the table where someone had spilled coffee long ago. The stain had the shape of a small continent. I realized I had been holding my shoulders up toward my ears, and I lowered them. My wife used to push her thumbs into that spot between my shoulder blades and tell my bones to return to themselves. I imagined the push and felt my breath obey. The blue folder's edge sat against my wrist like a steadying rail on a stair. Maya placed a palm on the table near my pen, not quite touching, reminding me without words that this too was a kind of homemaking. The president called a short recess so the clerk could verify the formatting of the attachments. People stood and stretched and spoke in the low bureaucratic voices of civic life. The liaison checked something on his tablet, then set it down and simply stood in the room as if to say he belonged to it too. The neighborhood watch coordinator remained seated, staring at the flowchart draft like a student sitting with an answer key. The neighbor nodded once at me on his way to the water cooler. The journalist remained by the back wall, letting the air move past him without making himself the current. When the meeting resumed, the agenda returned to its line and stepped neatly onto the place where my name waited. I closed my spiral notebook and slid it back from the edge, leaving room for whatever the room would set down. The blue folder rested against my forearm, warm with the heat of my skin, and the clock over the whiteboard moved forward 1 minute, then rested again. I could hear the quiet whir of the ceiling unit and the whisper of Maya's sleeve as she adjusted the tablet cable. My body found a stillness that was neither surrender nor fight. It was the poise of someone who has placed the right objects on the table and is prepared to let them speak. The president read the agenda item, and the room settled the way a dock settles when a boat ties off just right. I felt the blue folder against my forearm, the cardboard warm into my skin, and I let the objects carry the weight the way I had promised myself they would. The clerk's recorder light pulsed, steady and small. The liaison stood where the table cast a clean line of shadow, posture square, hands quiet. Maya adjusted the cable once, and the screen answered with our first slide, the numbers looking back as if time itself had taken a seat. I began with minutes, not feelings. The first lap time on my watch, the moment the cruiser rolled silent to the curb, the interval before the first question, and the gap where the body camera should have been listening. The neighbor's still frame filled the screen. There I was with my dog, leash slack, one glove in my pocket, the blue folder tucked against my ribs, a picture made of ordinary light. The room inhaled together and held it. The mail carrier's note card lay on the table beside my deed, like two corners of the same square. I named each item with the calm of a man labeling jars for a pantry he intends to use for a long time. Maya pulled the clips in order and slowed them where a second mattered. The doorbell time code snapped against the cruiser's arrival, a hinge that refused to lie. The path on my watch traced a clean loop with no detours.
the kind of path an old man and a good dog make when they set out to own nothing more than a morning. The HOA letter glowed under the overheads, its sentences dry as toast, the kind of dryness that resists panic. The county property page sat beside it like a ledger that forgot how to doubt. I did not raise my voice. I let paper and pixels work like rain seeping into soil. No drama, all consequence. The liaison described the department's policy in measured terms: activation upon contact, documentation when exceptions occur, retention schedules shaped by law and audit. He did not yield to the easy defense of busyness or habit. He acknowledged the late activation and said he would take that note back through channels with my incident number attached to it, not as a complaint filed in the dark, but as a line entered where it could not be misplaced. His voice carried the dry honesty of a man who knows the gears and intends to hit 'em click. The compliance chair underlined something in the draft in front of her, and I watched the ink settle.
The neighborhood watch coordinator spoke of concern, of patterns, of nights when shadows looked like intentions. He tried to hold the word community in front of him like a shield. He avoided the word suspicious with care, but the room had already learned the difference between a description and a label. The flowchart draft moved to the center of the table and found its spine. Observed conduct, note time, verify address if known, call only with objective detail, record witnesses, eliminate labels that do not describe behavior. The president rested her palm on that paper like a hand on a doorknob that turns toward light. I asked that the minutes capture my steps on the curb in the same plain order: request for a supervisor early, inquiry about camera activation at contact, presentation of documents, presence of witnesses, request for and receipt of an incident number. The clerk wrote without drama, the recorder blinking like a heartbeat. The neighbor gave formal permission to attach his clips to the record. The rectangle of his signature looked small and brave. The mail carrier's note card joined the packet, and his route minute became part of the room's time. The compliance chair proposed adopting the flowchart, not as a pilot, but as policy, with a prohibition on using the word suspicious in internal communications unless paired with a description of conduct. The president asked for a show of hands. It was not unanimous, but it was clear. The draft became lines that would live in binders and inboxes. A training date appeared on a dry erase board with the simplest of markers, 2 digits and a slash, black on white. The neighborhood watch coordinator's clipboard lost a layer of shine. He would remain in his role, but with the obligation to complete training and to submit monthly summaries of calls with documented conduct, time, and witness names. Consequence without spectacle is still consequence. The liaison spoke again, this time about cameras. Quarterly audit of activation times for spot checks with anonymized results shared to the HOA board and a public summary posted on the department's site. Additional training on initial contact activation with emphasis on non-enforcement interactions. A written notice would go to the officers involved in my stop, reminding them of activation policy and the duty to document exceptions in the moment, not in hindsight. He stopped short of names and punishment, as he should. He did not hide the reality that systems change in inches, not yards, but he promised inches that do not slip backward. The journalist from the back wall requested access to the adopted flowchart and the portion of the minutes that concerned policy. The president said those would be available once the clerk compiled attachments. No flourish, no spin, just paper moving into daylight. A few neighbors lifted phones to take pictures of the screen where the flowchart sat. I did not pose for anyone. I kept my hand on the blue folder and felt the edge press a small red line into my skin, a reminder that weight has shape and shape leaves marks. I looked up at the big clock and saw how the second hand behaved when a room chooses to behave.
The ceiling unit hummed without rattling. Someone adjusted a chair and did it quietly. Maya unplugged the cable and coiled it without looking down, her knuckles bending in a rhythm I recognized from the night she used to do homework at my table. She slid the tablet into her backpack and let her palm rest flat on the cover of my blue folder for one heartbeat, the way a person seals a letter with no wax, just intention.
The president asked if I had anything further to add for the record. I said I would submit a written summary of the timeline and a copy of the materials already presented, with the incident number at the top of the page. I asked that the minutes reflect my gratitude for the neighbor and the mail carrier who chose to show up as witnesses without making themselves heroes. I asked that the minutes show my request for the department's public summary of camera audits to be posted where residents can find it without guessing which link holds the truth. The liaison nodded. The clerk wrote. The room solidified itself around sentences that would outlast all of us. Subplots closed like drawers. The neighbor's clips were accepted and labeled. The mail carrier's note was scanned and returned to my hand with a faint warmth from the machine. The flowchart was adopted and assigned a number. The liaison's commitments were restated for the recorder. The neighborhood watch coordinator's training and reporting obligations were entered. No one clapped. The sound that followed was a softer thing, a release of muscles people didn't know they were holding. I packed the blue folder slowly, sleeves sliding into place with their precise, dry music. The deed found the bottom like a foundation stone. The letter and the tax receipt settled above it. The policy excerpt and the printouts of the clip's time codes lay on top, a lid I could trust. The president closed the agenda and thanked everyone for their civility. The clerk stopped the recorder and checked the file the way a careful person checks a sleeping child's breath. The liaison shook the president's hand and the compliance chair's, then gave me a firm nod that held the promise of a next email with details, not platitudes. The neighborhood watch coordinator kept his eyes on the flowchart a moment longer, then stood with the clipboard held correctly at his side. I stood too and let my shoulders find their natural height. The chair legs made a soft sound as I put them back under the table. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner again and something warmer, a little like dust warmed by lights that have done their work. Maya shouldered her backpack and reached for the leash I had looped on the chair leg. My dog would be waiting at home, head by the window where he sleeps through rain and wakes at car doors. I slipped the blue folder under my arm, the way I used to cradle my granddaughter when she was small enough to fit against me without effort. Outside, evening had arrived with a mild breeze. The lot's gravel gave under my shoes, that small crunch that always reminds me of theater parking lots on community nights. People passed without needing to look twice. The president stepped out with the clerk and turned toward the office. The liaison crossed to a city sedan and started the engine. The neighborhood watch coordinator paused by the Xeriscape bed and looked at the sage as if it might tell him how to be less certain about the wrong things. I nodded to no one and to everyone and felt the day release its fist. Peace did not land like a parade. It settled like a key in a familiar lock. I breathed in the faint smell of sage and hot dust and cool air and let procedure be the language I had learned to speak when opinion tried to rename me. When a street narrows under someone else's fear, widen it with process and presence. When opinion closes a door, open it with proof and patience. If you valued this story, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you would do in my place. Until the next story.